Whakataka te hou ki te uru, whakataka te hou ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, kia hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe, moriora. So welcome everybody to this LIANZA webinar, and I'd really like to welcome Dr. Kathryn Oxborrow, who's going to be presenting her PhD research looking at non-Māori librarians, looking at ways to extend their understanding and learn about and engage with mātauranga Māori knowledge. So welcome, Kathryn, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā kārangatanga maha ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Stockhill toku maunga, ko Oos toku awa, ko Ngāti Ingarangi me Ngāti Kotarani o Kuiwi. Ko Kathryn toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora everyone, and thanks so much for coming along to this webinar today. It's lovely to see some familiar faces and some that I haven't yet met. Welcome to all of you. My name is Kathryn, and it's my privilege today to share with you some of the process and findings from my PhD, and hopefully give you some practical ideas on how you can engage individually and as part of the profession more widely. Why is that not changing? I think I've shared the wrong screen, sorry, bear with me. Sorry about that. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what I'll be talking about this evening, here's a little bit of an outline. I'll start off by talking a bit about myself and my background and how I came to this topic. I'll then share about what I did and the model I used to investigate my research question. I'll then get into some of the findings from the two sets of data, interviews and focus groups. Because of time, I'll be mainly focusing on the interview findings this evening, but also discussing some times with the focus groups as they relate to helps and barriers to engaging. We'll take a pause for questions after that, if we're making good time, which I imagine we should be. Next, I'll say a bit about what the interviewees had to say about LIANZA professional registration. And then finally, I'll share some thoughts about what the findings mean in practice for individual non-Māori librarians and the profession as a whole. And then there'll be some more time for questions at the end, hopefully. Great, so let's get into it. As you may be able to tell from my accent, if you haven't met me before, I'm from the UK originally. I moved to Aotearoa from Yorkshire in England in 2010, and I've worked sort of in and around libraries in various places, National Library, public libraries, professional education for librarianship, as well as tertiary and health libraries. I started my PhD in 2014 part-time, and I completed it last year. I've always been really interested in different cultures, and so when I moved here, I was particularly keen to learn about and engage with Māori culture in my life and work. I was somewhat surprised along the way to find that not everybody I came across necessarily had that same enthusiasm. So that was the start of what would become my main research question, which is how are non-Māori librarians in Aotearoa, New Zealand making sense of mātauranga Māori. I use the term mātauranga Māori as it is discussed in the context of LIANZA professional registration, which is as Māori knowledge or knowledge paradigms. So the way I chose to approach the study was to use a framework through which to consider the question of non-Māori librarians and Māori knowledge. The framework I chose was Dervin's sense-making, a theory and approach which originated in communication studies in North America, but has been widely used in the library and information studies field due to the place of information and knowledge as a central feature of the model. It's essentially a theory of human information behaviour, which also appealed as it kept my topic firmly in the realm of information studies rather than potentially veering off into other fields such as sociology, psychology, or professional development studies. So Dervin's sense-making has grown and developed over the years, but at its core, there is a set of stages that an individual takes to address their information gaps. So an individual is walking along on their journey of life and they potentially meet an information gap or a knowledge gap that stops them in their tracks. The individual then needs to find a way to bridge that gap to reach an outcome and carry on moving. And there will be factors which help a person to bridge the gap as well as potential barriers to doing so. For an example, I might be in a situation where I'm studying at university and I have an essay to do. The topic is new to me, and so that is a gap. I go to the library, of course, and find some resources related to the topic, which I read and sort of engage with, and that's the bridge. And then the outcome is that I write the essay and pass the course. Things that help me might be encouragement from my lecturer or additional resources from my lecturer to get me started. And barriers might be unfamiliarity with the library's systems or being really busy with other work or something like that. So when it came to investigating the question of non-Māori engagement with mātauranga Māori, I used the concepts of the sense-making framework to guide my approach to data collection. Sense-making also has its own methodological approach in terms of interview format, so that guided some of the questions I put together. So just to tell you a bit about my interviewees next. 41 non-Māori librarians responded to an open call for participants through NZ Libs and a blog post on the LIANZA website. The sense-making interview format is very in-depth and can generate a lot of data. So I was unable to interview everyone who volunteered, unfortunately. So I narrowed the list down to 25 interviewees so as not to be drowning in data. I went for a sample with the widest possible variety in terms of subsectors worked in, numbers of years experience and location. And I aimed for approximately half and half registered and unregistered registered participants. Everyone who was previously registered was included because that was also an important perspective to include. So here on this table is the spread of interviewees. It's a bit complex. The key columns to look at are the FS columns, as those are the numbers for the final sample. Being that my own experiences as someone who at the time of the research had moved to New Zealand from overseas less than 10 years previous, I decided not to include those who were in that similar situation, just to maintain some level of distance from the stories that were being shared with me. So after some warm-up questions, I asked each interviewee to start by giving me a timeline of instances in their life where they had learned about or engaged with Māori knowledge. The number of instances that each interviewee told me about varied from just one or two to quite long lists. The individual focus of the interview technique did lead to some discussions on professional development topics, which were connected to mātauranga Māori, but not technically mātauranga Māori in and of themselves, such as the te tiriti or waitangi. Once each participant had given this timeline, we discussed between 1 and 3 of their particular instances in more depth. And I asked questions which tied into the different stages of the sense-making process, as well as a couple of questions about professional registration at the end. Once I had done some initial analysis of the interviews, I then undertook 3 focus groups with Māori librarians in Christchurch, Wellington and Auckland. The aim of the focus groups was to hear from Māori librarians about their experiences with their non-Māori colleagues' engagement with Māori knowledge, to be able to contrast that with what the interviewees had said. For the focus groups, I approached potential participants directly based on contacts that my supervisors or I already had, or asked existing contacts for suggestions of others who might like to be involved. It was really important to make space in this research for Māori to have a chance to share their perspectives. What I found was that the experiences shared by the Māori librarians and their contrast with the interview findings led to some of the most important findings of the research project as a whole. Some of the questions I asked in the focus groups were connected to the sense-making process stages, while others were more broad. So let's get into some of the interview findings now. While there are potentially sort of hours worth of findings that I could talk to you about, I'm just going to highlight some key ones from the situation, gap and bridge stages of the sense-making process to start with, and then we'll get on to a few helps and barriers after that. So starting with the situation, interviewees talked about 2 different types of situations. Firstly, where they became aware that they needed to bridge a gap in their information or knowledge because of personal interest or kind of moral imperative. For example, interviewees talked about signing up for a course or seeking out some knowledge because it was something that they were interested in more broadly, such as being interested in learning languages, for example, or they believed it was the right thing to do from a social justice perspective, something they should do. Interviewees also described instances in their lives where they were genuinely stopped in a situation because of an information or knowledge gap related to Māori knowledge that they needed to address immediately. A lot of interviewees talked about their sense of their gaps in relation to mātauranga Māori being quite big. Sometimes this was in retrospect, where they realised that they didn't know what they didn't know or how much they didn't know until they started scratching the surface and learning something. The types of gaps that interviewees discussed fell into 2 main categories: Māori and libraries, and language and cultural protocol. Te Reo Māori. Māori and libraries was a broad topic with gaps mentioned, including understanding the status of information as a taonga, understanding how Māori engage with libraries and how they might engage differently with libraries to other customers. Sources of Māori information and Māori research approaches. Te reo and tikanga gaps related to being able to understand, pronounce or speak Te Reo Māori, and understanding cultural protocols such as consultation, giving a mihi or taking part in a welcome, or being able to sing a waiata, are a few examples of that. There were 3 types of bridges. The first was courses. This covered a broad range of courses, from te reo courses, papers taken as part of tertiary study, one-off talks or presentations, or workshops such as the mātauranga Māori within New Zealand Libraries course run by Te Raupu Whakahau. The second type of bridge was books and text resources, where interviewees sought to address their knowledge gaps through reading books or online materials such as blogs. The third category was people and situations, which was mainly around other people sharing their knowledge with the interviewees, but also included professional association involvement that provided opportunities to develop knowledge, as well as discussion and reflection. So an interesting part of the interviews was when we talked about helps and barriers. I also asked focus group participants about helps and barriers, so there are some interesting comparisons to make here. Both interviewees and focus group participants discussed both helps and barriers broadly in terms of internal and external factors. In terms of helps, a help that both interviewees and focus group participants discussed was safety and comfort, that it was easier for non-Māori to engage in an environment where they felt safe and comfortable. The interviewees said a lot about how relationships were important, such as having a supportive kaiako or learning facilitator, etc. Focus groups also pointed out that being open to engaging was something that helped. Interviewees noted that tying in their learning and engagement with existing skills or interests was something that helped them engage as well. The barriers were particularly interesting in terms of contrasts. Fear was a key concept discussed by both interviewees and focus group participants. From the interviewees' perspectives, there were those who spoke about fear being a barrier for themselves or for colleagues, but there were others who acknowledged the fear, but were helped by having the resources within themselves to push through it because they knew they needed to continue to engage. Similarly, some interviewees found it hard to keep being corrected if they got things wrong, while others acknowledged that they needed the correction to help them eventually improve, and acknowledged the generosity of individuals who persevered with them in order to help them to get there. Focus group participants also discussed fear that could prevent non-Māori colleagues from engaging if they were worried about doing something wrong and causing offence, or if they had been corrected in the past and had decided to withdraw because of it. This quote reflects that quite well. I won't read it out. I'll give you a second to have a look at it. The Māori librarians contrasted this with a tendency that they had experienced for their non-Māori colleagues to be overly reliant on them in relation to Māori clients, queries or knowledge in the workplace, even when the level of knowledge required was quite basic or the source of information was easily accessible, like an online dictionary. The external or practical barriers were discussed in more depth by interviewees. They spoke about problems like not knowing where to get the information they needed, or having limited time or resources. The main external barrier which focus group participants discussed was backlash from other non-Māori who might challenge whether developing this knowledge was important or relevant. Okay, so I've kind of bombarded you with a whole heap of information there. So we can stop for some questions if we have some questions.
If you want to ask a question, I would just suggest unmuting and going ahead and asking, or if you prefer, just to put it into the chat.
Hi, kia ora.
Kia ora, go ahead.
Kia ora.
Kia ora
Go ahead,
tātou.
Janet.
I was thinking in terms of asking questions. Sometimes I personally find it difficult to ask the right questions of my Māori colleagues that may be able to help. And also I'm aware that sometimes they may not know, and also I think this is sometimes embarrassing for them. So it's kind of a little bit tricky. Sometimes it's a little bit sensitive. Yeah. How do you... Yeah, I mean, I guess I do just persevere a lot of the time, but it can be sensitive sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. There were a couple of comments around that in terms of sort of needing to, if you're a non-Māori person who has sort of developed some level of knowledge, for example, being humble with that at the same time, and sort of not sort of flashing it around like you know the answers. I mean, that's not quite exactly the same as what you're saying, but I'm thinking in terms of I don't want to go beyond what people said to me. Yeah, so it's a difficult balance, because at the same on one hand we don't want to overburden, but at the same time we don't want to sort of overstep either. So it's like you say, it is kind of finding the balance within your own sort of situation, and sometimes that's probably going to be trial and error, I imagine, but sort of keeping on persevering with trying to engage and to be a good ally and that kind of thing.
There's another question there in the chat. With the backlash from other people, was that reported across all the groups interviewed?
So let me think. So the backlash from other people, that was in my... Now, I intended to have my thesis right next to me so I could check if someone asked me a taxing question like that. So of the 3 focus groups, bear with me a moment, I'm disappearing. I can't remember whether it was mentioned in all of the groups. That was something I did actually put together a diagram in my thesis. Sorry, I'm being geeky now. Right, let's see. So that was something that was mentioned in 2 out of the 3 groups. So it wasn't the biggest thing, but it was mentioned by more than one group. No, it's good. I'm glad that you're interested. So thank you for asking.
Can I just clarify, the backlash, was it from the focus groups of Māori librarians who had noticed that had
Yeah,
happened?
so this was just thought. I asked the Māori librarians what they thought might be barriers. I think I asked what I thought might be barriers. Yes, I did. I asked them what they thought might be helps for non-Māori librarians in terms of engaging. I asked them what they thought might be barriers. And a lot of the barriers they actually spoke about were internal barriers rather than external. So that's I just mentioned that because that was the main external one that they mentioned. A lot of the other ones that they talked about were internal, and I'll come to I might well that's yeah, no, I did mention it. The fear one was kind of and those other related ones were quite important and significant. How did I synthesize? So Donna's asking, how did I synthesize the information I gathered, and did I come up with some conclusions? So I used thematic analysis. So what that involves is that I treated the two sets of data separately, not differently, and I analysed them. So I transcribed those, and then I went through and I did some initial coding and grouped the codes into themes, and then sort of looked at those themes and kind of worked with those themes to see whether they were, how they kind of hung together, and then I sort of refined those and discussed them with my supervisors and that kind of thing. And I did the same thing with the focus group data as well. In terms of comparing those, I didn't do that. I didn't sort of code them together. When I was looking at them in my discussion, I sort of compared the two sets of findings at that level. And conclusions. I mean, some of the conclusions I'll talk about in the next bit in terms of what I think I think some outcomes could be, and hopefully that'll be helpful.
That's great. Thanks, Kathryn.
And so Inika's asking, was wider organisational support mentioned as a help? Yeah, it was actually. So I mean, it was. So sense making is very individually focused. So so it was kind of there were mentions of it both from the interviewees and from the focus groups. And so in terms of the interviewees, that would have been in the people and situations category of helps, whereby if they were in a supportive working environment, for example, that would be considered as a help. And yeah, the focus groups talked about the role of the organisation as well, being quite important. So yeah, I mean, I wasn't able to take a very strong focus on that because of the individual focus of sense making, but there were definitely allusions to that, and there's definitely scope for further research in that kind of area.
Kiora, yes. What contributions your research project bring to library service in general?
Wow. Well, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in terms of I did make some suggestions in my thesis about how how we could move this kind of kaupapa forward. And yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that when we've moved on from this section of questions. Yeah, I mean, I do hope to write some publications beyond my thesis as well, to make a contribution in that way. At some point, I'd like to sort of write a book that's kind of maybe a bit less sort of academic-y, to kind of help get some of those findings out there. Awesome. So shall we, I think we'll move on, and then if we've got any more questions, then hopefully we'll have some time for those at the end. Thanks for all those questions. Those have been good ones. Right. I'll get my share back up. Okay, so while the sense-making process was a key aspect of the data collection for the interviews, I also asked some questions specifically about LIANZA professional registration. And those kind of sat outside of the scope of the sense-making framework, but it was kind of important to ask. The reason I was interested in that was that the body of knowledge for LIANZA professional registration includes body of knowledge element 11, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, BoK 11, which requires everyone who revalidates their registration to demonstrate that they have undertaken some professional development that is related to mātauranga Māori. I was interested to find out what kind of role BoK 11 might have played in relation to learning and engagement with mātauranga Māori within the profession. So registration was very rarely discussed by interviewees in relation to their instances of learning and development, and was not a big influencing factor for the vast majority of interviewees who engaged with mātauranga Māori, though there were a few exceptions to this. I asked interviewees whether the inclusion of BoK 11 had influenced their decisions to become or not become registered, or to continue or not continue being registered, depending on their circumstances. None of the participants were negatively influenced by the inclusion of BoK 11, and one said that it was a positive factor that encouraged them to engage with the scheme. Some commented that they would have registered regardless of whether BoK 11 was included, because part of their sense of being a professional librarian was demonstrating their commitment to professional development. I also asked registered interviewees about whether the inclusion of BoK 11 in the body of knowledge had impacted their journeys of learning and engagement in relation to Māori knowledge. There was a split between those who felt their journeys had been impacted and those who did not. Those who felt it had impacted their journeys spoke about factors such as an increased number of learning opportunities since registration was introduced, having to be more organised or intentional about meeting the BoK 11 requirements for revalidation. And one interviewee had a particularly transformational experience through the mātauranga Māori within New Zealand Libraries workshop, which they had attended purely to tick off their BoK 11. Those who said their journey had not been impacted said that they would have engaged anyway. This was backed up by the majority of these having discussed instances that predated either their involvement with librarianship or the professional registration scheme itself. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop overview of some of my findings. Thanks for your attention so far. So moving on now to the final section of my presentation this evening. Some thoughts and practical suggestions about what we can do as individual non-Māori librarians and as a profession to support this journey of moving us all forward in this space. One question that I asked interviewees in relation to every instance of learning and engagement that we discussed was whether they had problems or whether they had had any problems because of what they didn't know. The answer was no in 36 instances out of 51 for 20 interviewees out of 25. Combined with points raised by focus group participants, this highlights that it is quite possible for a non-Māori librarian who decides that they do not want to engage with mātauranga Māori in their work to potentially choose not to do so without any impact on their career. This causes problems for the sense-making model. And so I created a new image that illustrates what I found in my research. Now, there is a lot of information on this image here, some of which I haven't covered tonight. But the main thing I want you to notice is that there is now a kind of detour or bypass around the whole sense-making process. This represents those non-Māori who opt out of engaging with anything to do with mātauranga Māori and still carry on their journeys. Going back to barriers and how the Māori librarians in my focus groups spoke a lot about their non-Māori colleagues declining to engage with Māori people or knowledge, even in the most basic ways, which led to themselves becoming overburdened with that mahi and potentially becoming stressed and burnt out. It's clear that the two issues are linked. The more non-Māori avoid engaging, the more our Māori colleagues have to pick up the slack and are overworked and stressed, and potentially more likely to leave the profession altogether. Now, since it is our desire as a profession to have more Māori librarians and not less, we need to think about how we can do something about this. So the first point I want to make is connected to that. Because we live in this culture that can still marginalise Māori people and knowledge and offers the opportunity to opt out of engaging, we need to be constantly aware of the need to be proactive in this space. While some workplaces are making moves to incorporate more Māori cultural awareness and practices across the whole organisation, there are still places where this is not the case, or projects can begin but then lose momentum. So what I'm saying is there is still a big part to be played by individual non-Māori librarians through taking the initiative to find ways to keep moving themselves forward on this journey of learning and engagement with mātauranga Māori. Don't wait for a course to come up. Be active in seeking out the next opportunity. If you haven't had the chance to go on the mātauranga Māori within New Zealand Libraries workshop, both interviewees and focus group participants had positive things to say about it. And it is focused on the library context, which is helpful for understanding the connections. I've had a look and there aren't any coming up at the moment, but you keep your eye out on the listservs or the Te Reo Whakahau website for future offerings. A big topic that was talked about a lot by both interviewees and focus group participants was Te Reo Māori. Several interviewees spoke about experiences of learning Te Reo and how it was a key for them to engage with broader tikanga aspects as well. Te Reo was also a really central theme in the focus groups too. So it won't surprise you that one of my strong recommendations is to learn some Te Reo Māori. This slide has a few suggestions for resources or organisations that can help you learn. Now's a good time to take a screenshot if you want to go away and have a look at some of these resources later. I've listed the 3 wānanga who offer Te Reo classes. Some of them have online distance options. Te Wānanga o Raukawa have a good one, which is starting in July. There are also opportunities through other organisations such as universities and polytechnics, community education providers and some workplaces. I'm taking my own advice, by the way. I've signed up to an evening class with Te Wānanga o Aotearoa to study Te Reo this year with a wonderful kaiako and a great group of classmates. It's hard work at times, but really worthwhile. If you're not able to commit to a class, there are some other wonderful resources out there. Books, TV shows, podcasts, Facebook groups. I've just highlighted a few of my favourites, but there are heaps available to match your level and availability in terms of time commitment. There are also conversations that we need to have that are wider than just individual efforts to engage. One really important finding that came through from the focus groups was the flow-on effect of lack of engagement by non-Māori librarians on our Māori colleagues. It was interesting to note in the interviews that a key potential barrier was fear. Fear of causing offence, of making a mistake, of what others will think, or fear of the unknown. This is expressed quite well in this quote from one of the interviewees. One of the first kind of panic things that can happen as a non-Māori person, and you see a Māori person turn up and they're like, I want some information about a Māori issue. You're like, oh, can I find someone who's Māori to answer that question? I don't feel qualified. Focus group participants spoke about how this fear can be one factor leading to inaction and avoidance of engagement with anything related to Māori culture. As I've already alluded to, the big flow-on effect of this, which focus group participants discussed in all 3 groups, was how non-Māori colleagues would pass work or queries onto them if they were Māori related, even if these things needed only basic information skills to resolve, such as low-level reference queries, or even asking for translations of Māori words, which could easily be found on Māori Dictionary online. The build-up of this can lead to Māori in the library profession being overworked and burnt out, and potentially leaving the profession. While reflecting on this issue when writing my thesis, it struck me that this is not only a cultural issue, but also an ethical one. Having one group of professionals being overburdened and stressed, while another group can choose to disengage, and thus creating that stress, is problematic ethically. Further investigations led me to the discovery that the profession's code of ethics, LIANZA's code of ethics, known as the Code of Professional Conduct, has not changed significantly since the original version was produced in the 1980s. This code states that we as librarians have a primary duty to our clients and to society. I suggest that we also have certain duties as regards our colleagues also, and IFLA includes reference to this in their own suggested code of ethics for library and information professionals and associations. I believe it is time for a discussion about professional ethics with a view to revisiting and updating the code. Having a discussion to raise awareness of the impact that inaction can have on Māori colleagues could have an impact simply by making it part of the conversation. There was no indication on the part of interviewees that they or others were declining to engage in order to deliberately create more work for their Māori colleagues. So having more awareness of this might serve as a catalyst for non-Māori to push past some of their own fear in order to become more collegial. I just wanted to finish with this quote from one of my interviewees. I look on everything I've done in this arena, and it was one of the best learning experiences of my life, really. Whatever you choose to do to engage, I would encourage you that the vast majority of the outcomes that the people I interviewed spoke about were positive, and for some it had been life-changing or certainly life-enhancing. So go for it. It's important for me at the end of any presentation to acknowledge everyone who supported me in this long and challenging project. I was humbled by the experience to be part of so many interesting conversations and that so many great people were willing to share their experiences of this important topic with me. I'm thankful for everyone who took part and to the numerous supporters of the kaupapa across the years. Ngā mihi ki a koutou. I've experienced some challenges this last year, as many of us have, which have prevented me from sharing the findings of this research as much as I would have liked, but there is more to come. I've submitted an abstract for LIANZA conference to talk more about the findings from my focus groups, so hopefully I'll be able to share some more then, and I will be looking for other opportunities to share as well. Or you can go and look up my thesis online if you're really keen to get into the nitty-gritty of it. Nō reira e hoa mā, kua whakarongo mai ki tēnei kōrero I te pōnei. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was so interesting, and it will be great to hear more from your research at the conference and in other places. Did you want to take any more questions now, if anybody had any?
Yeah, sure. I think there's the chat's been flashing.
Did anybody have a question? There's some very appreciative comments in the chat going on. Thank you. I agree with you around the code of ethics. I think it's high time that was picked up and had a good look at. So it's on our list of things to do in the next little while. So if anybody here is interested in being involved, look out for a call on that one. Can't guarantee it's going to be in the next 3 months, but it might be after that. Yeah. Yeah. So if nobody has got a question, we'll close the session now. And again, thank you, Kathryn, so much. It's really interesting, and it obviously is a topic that is of great interest to the people here tonight, but I think the wider profession as well. Yes. So I'll just close with a karakia and bid you all good night. And yeah, so anuhia, anuhia, anuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātea, kia mama, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takatā. Ko e rā e rongo, whakairia aki ki runga. Kia tina, tina, huie, taike. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming, everyone.